Two extremely good cameras, same shots, no labels. Can you tell a difference? Today we are going to find out if the brand new Lumix hybrid camera can take on the extremely popular dedicated video camera, the Sony FX3. Multiple side-by-side tests to find out if the S1RII has more dynamic range, is the FX3 still the best low-light video camera, and do we have a hybrid camera that has dethroned the mirrorless video king? Let's jump in here with a challenging shot for any camera. They are both at max resolutions and both at native ISO. First thing that jumps out to me is on the Lumix, if you look at the wall on the left hand side, there is just more information and detail. Even where the light enters through the door, along the floor, you can just see down the sides a little bit more information and detail. This could be down to the S1RII having more dynamic range, but as you can also see, the Sony FX3 likes to come out of camera with a little bit more contrast. Very close images here. The Lumix is definitely a little bit sharper. This can sometimes be a negative thing in the world of video. Personally, I don't mind it too much, and I think the Lumix is doing a pretty good job at getting rid of all that nastiness that we get from smaller sensors like smartphones and drones. And looking at my skin tone here, I don't think it's doing too much or over sharpening. Let's get into ISO, and to start us off we have the second native ISO on the Lumix, which is 4000 when dynamic range expansion is turned on. These two are actually very close, and that is really impressive for the FX3, noting that it is not at its native ISO range like the Lumix is. That said though, the Lumix is just a little bit cleaner. If you pay attention to the brick on the wall of the building, you can see there's just a little bit more noise on the Sony. Next, I wanted to go in the middle of the two second native ISOs of each camera, which is 4000 on the Lumix and 12800 on the FX3, meaning I chose 8000. Here though, the Lumix is really starting to pull away in this zone. We have loads of chroma noise in there, which is really ugly, and it's what you don't want for video. So up to 12800, which is the second native ISO for the Sony FX3. But both of these cameras look really good, say how high we are up that ISO range, and with a little bit of noise reduction in post, these are totally usable images. It is good to know that inside the FX3, Sony don't allow the user to change any noise reduction settings. They do say there is noise reduction being applied, but it's controlled by them on the amount of ISO you push up in the camera. Where flip that, Lumix do allow you to manually control your noise reduction, and for all these tests I've turned it off, so there is no noise reduction happening inside camera. If you was to turn that up, I can only imagine that you would get much better results, maybe pushing this even further. Up to 51200 ISO and we actually start to see some differences. There is definitely more noise here in the Lumix, and it has started to lean a little bit green. But overall, I do think the Lumix looks a little bit better in terms of colours than the Sony. To me here, the Sony's gone a bit washed out and looks almost black and white. There is definitely less noise in the Sony though. I did try to denoise these images, and from my personal threshold, these are unusable at this point. But I know everyone shoots different style of content and people may need this kind of stuff. Finally, max on both cameras and the Sony FX3 being able to punch all the way up in camera to 409,000 ISO just runs away with it. The reason the Sony looks so much brighter here is because I left camera settings and lens aperture and everything all the same, just to show you how much brighter in camera the FX3 can go. But that said, again, from my own personal opinion, both of these images are absolute garbage and both very unusable. This is another tricky shot for any camera, but I think it's a good example to see the colour differences. The Lumix tends to lean warm, where the Sony FX3 tends to lean cold, which is quite a surprise, as when I used to compare my FX3 to my S5 II from Lumix, I would always find the FX3 was warmer, meaning we have taken quite a big step into the warmer tones and colours with this new Lumix camera. And the only other thing that stands out to me is on the Lumix there is much more detail along the stone floor, but other than that these are pretty close images. Another great example for colour comparison here, and colours, remember, are subjective, so what you may think is better is not right or wrong, it is just which you prefer. Personally, I much prefer the Lumix colors here. The sky on the Sony just looks a little bit artificial and kind of not really like jumps out, where I much prefer the more neutral and natural look of the even color palette coming out of the Lumix. Here is the brand new color profile CineLike A, which is ARRI inspired from Lumix, versus the extremely popular Sony S-CineTone. The first thing to look at here is over my right shoulder, that arch in the stones. Is that clipped on the Sony? If not, it is extremely close to losing detail, where on the Lumix we can see it has handled it much better. Not only that though, but my face looks a little bit darker to me on the Sony, so we can't really say that it's prioritized the dark parts of the image, as there is just more information in my face and in the brighter parts on the Lumix. For me, this puts into perspective how much of a good job Lumix have done with this new ARRI inspired colour profile. It's really neutral while holding on to tons of dynamic range to say that you're getting instant cinematic look right out of camera. And comparing these two images in this situation, it may differ elsewhere. I actually prefer it to S-CineTone. This is max resolution on both cameras locked off on a tripod because I want to compare detail and sharpness. Again though, right out of camera we are seeing that much more contrasted, punchier look from the Sony, and when we crop in we start to see some of the advantages of that 8.1K sensor from the Lumix. There is tons more information, detail and sharpness on the Lumix. We can go back to the argument that sharpness can be negative for video, but for me, it is more how the camera deals with it. And Sony themselves would probably agree, knowing that their Venice 2 camera has an 8K sensor and that has produced some of the most beautiful images we have ever seen. So let's get into AF. It is super difficult for me to show you here what is actually happening on the Sony, as it has this awkward HDMI limitation where when you ask it to output the information and overlays that you see on the camera screen, it does not let you use the camera screen, which means I can't tap on faces and subjects. But we can still see what is in focus and out of focus. I did do some overexposure and underexposure just to test if any of the cameras was clearly worse than the other. And to be totally honest, they are pretty much the same. I think we are at a point now where for tracking people with eye autofocus and subject detection, both cameras are simply good enough. You may see that when I'm re-entering the frame, the Lumix is catching and finding my face much faster than the Sony. But this was simply down to a setting in the camera. I went and changed and retested and everything was equal once again. But where it is not equal though is when it comes to tracking subjects that are not detected by the cameras. Lumix here just feels a little bit unconfident, but we need to remember that the Sony has been out for years and years, and I'm testing a sample camera that is not even available to the public. Hopefully Lumix release firmware updates to make this better, as that is what they did with their previous cameras. So on to the latest trend on the internet, and it is rolling shutter. For the first test, I put both cameras in their fastest available full frame readout mode, which is 4K 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second on both cameras. I am actually super surprised at how close these results actually are. To say the FX3 is like god tier with its super fast readout sensor, and the Lumix has been getting a lot of negativity, I think these are probably not going to be noticed by the average person. Even more so that I had to take the shutter all the way to 1/500 just so we could see it, as motion blur hides this even more. But if we go to that 8.1K on the Lumix and turn on dynamic range expansion, we do start to see how bad the rolling shutter can get in this camera. I would just simply avoid this mode for like 60-70% of my entire shots, as I think there is an option to make this camera totally fine when it comes to rolling shutter. And just to present an example of what it actually looks like with the 180-degree shutter angle, as we would normally shoot for natural motion blur, and in the fastest readout mode of 4K 50 frames per second, I am struggling to even see a difference here. And this is waving the cameras around like a bit of a maniac, what you probably would not really do. And to me, these look pretty identical. So let's get into comparing in-body image stabilization. This first one here is just everything turned off so we can get a base level of what it looks like with me just doing a steady walk. Now this one is the physical IBIS turned on, so the IBIS is moving the sensor around inside of each camera body. This is very close here, maybe a tiny bit better on the Lumix, but impressive from the FX3, as I thought the Lumix would kind of win in this situation. Moving into digital stabilization, and the Sony only has one option here, and that is active. So I thought I would start by comparing that into the brand new cropless digital stabilization from Lumix. I do think the Sony looks a little bit smoother here, but it comes with a crop, which does actually matter, because the whole benefit of the new cropless IBIS mode is it will remove the edge wobbles you get when using in-body image stabilization on extremely wide lenses. But when we do go into max modes on both cameras, you can see here there's a bigger crop now on the Lumix, but I would say the Lumix now looks smoother. Overall, the takeaway for me is that I would rather have the Lumix options, as there is just more fine tuning and modes available, where it's a bit basic on the Sony. Into super slow motion, and this one caught me off guard. I totally missed this when doing my first impressions of the S1RII Mark II video, and that is why you should always test cameras before giving a definitive answer. And this is the reason. Looking at these 120 frames, 4K shots from both cameras, they look pretty identical even in terms of colour. But punching in, you can clearly see the FX3 has so much more detail, which means there is some serious line skipping or pixel binning going on to downsize that 8.1K sensor to 4K and then capture 120 frames from the sensor. Battery life test, and if you'd have asked me to guess prior to this test, I think I would have got it quite a bit different. So I rolled both cameras at 4K 25 frames per second to get apples to apples, obviously because there is no 8K mode inside the FX3. We got to 1 hour and 31 minutes on the Lumix, which is actually way better than I expected. That left us with 25% battery left on the FX3, meaning it has a 25% better battery life, and I'm sure the maths works out here. We got to 2 hours before the FX3 died. So we're talking about an extra 30 minutes of battery life on the FX3, which is fantastic. But in the real world use case, that probably only translates to 1 extra battery per day, 2 at most. And I don't know about any of you out there, but when I'm rolling for a take longer than 20 or 30 minutes, I'm running external power anyways. This could be a whole video by itself for this section, so I'm not going to start digging into all the little settings and ergonomical tweaks. I'm just kind of talk about the big overall features and differences that I found using these in the real world. I will start with build quality, and there is not a lot to talk about. Both these cameras are very good and both really well made. They are both to the higher side of mirrorless cameras, and I don't think anyone would have any issues with any of them. I do love the form factor of the FX3, and one of my biggest praises about that camera was just simply by removing all the photo options, it made it so simple to use. I also totally love the top handle that comes with the FX3 and just makes it feel a bit more video focused. That said, we now have the mode dial on the S1RII, which pretty much does the same thing and removes all those photo options, so it gets pretty equal. You can also get the top mounted audio XLR module for the Lumix, which gives us 32-bit flow audio internally. And in terms of features, it's all a bit back to front because the FX3 is the dedicated video camera and the Lumix hybrid camera has more video focused features, which surely should be the other way around. And the biggest one of all is false color. This for me is even more important on a smaller camera with its small display than it is on all the big expensive cinema cameras that you're more than likely going to be using an EVF or a big external monitor on. Before I talk about the elephant in the room and get into the biggest advantage of all about the S1RII Mark II, let's talk about the big advantage for the FX3. And that is simpler E-mount lenses. It's no secret that the E-mount lens system that Sony have built with third-party providers is kind of the best one available at the moment. But L-mount is getting better, and it's not like that the lenses are not available for L-mount. Once you lean into the Sigma ecosystem, and we're now seeing loads of third-party lenses jump on board, I think you are actually totally fine. The massive one for Lumix, and the reason that I'm even creating this video, it is simply a hybrid camera. I'm not one to know much about photos, but from when I've taken the thumbnails and the odd family photo on the FX3, I've not really been happy with them For me, they don't have that kind of fidelity of a high resolution sensor. They're not bad at all, it's still a full frame, really good sensor. Take it with a pinch of salt, as I don't know much about photography, but for me it's pretty much night and day difference. The photos, the EVF, the whole experience of taking photos on the S1RII is miles ahead of what you can actually do on the FX3. And the last one is both of these bodies have built-in fans. There is pretty much no way to get the FX3 to overheat unless you put it in an oven and turn it on. There is definitely a way to get the Lumix to overheat. In 8K, in the default fan mode, it does overheat, which is quite disappointing from Lumix. They do allow you to go into the settings and adjust the fan mode, and when I've got it in the max fan mode, which is quite audible, I cannot get it to overheat from my testing in 8.1K. When I drop down to 5.9K and 4K, there is no overheating at all from my testing, even in the default fan modes. That may differ depending on where you live, but I think at least in 4K to match up to the FX3, you would be safe from any overheating. Here I expose both cameras for my skin tone, and I'm going to under and overexpose the camera and show the recovery. It's worth noting that I captured in ProRes on the Lumix, as it can do this internally and you don't need an external recorder like the FX3. What I did not do though is capture in ProRes RAW, as I am a DaVinci Resolve user and it is also cropped, so there is no full frame ProRes RAW in this Lumix. So starting with 2 stops overexposed, and both of these have lost a little bit of colour information and also lost a little bit of detail, but overall pretty good results. Moving on to 3 stops overexposed, and both cameras have lost a lot of detail and look pretty washed, so I didn't bother going on much further than this. I'm actually pretty impressed with the FX3, knowing that it does not have that ProRes codec that I thought would have helped the Lumix out a lot more. Moving on to 2 stops underexposed, and there's a little bit to unpack here. The Lumix probably looks a little bit noisier, but it has held on to the colour information a lot better, and you could probably denoise it to achieve a pleasanter image, where the FX3, while it looks a lot cleaner, has kind of washed out the shadows with its blue tint, and this kind of lines up and matches what we're seeing in the low light tests. Moving on to 3 stops underexposed, and it's pretty much more of the same. Both cameras have visible fixed pattern noise here, and it would be really difficult to save these images. So again, better colours on the Lumix with a little bit more noise. The FX3 a bit cleaner, but has an even worse kind of blue cast across the entire image. On a side note though, as you can probably see, the Lumix is hunting a little bit more for my face, and its AF system does not seem to be working quite as good. I think it's super good news for us camera people and consumers that we are now seeing something that is not only a hybrid camera that takes exceptional photos, that it also goes blow for blow with an incredible video camera like the Sony FX3. And not only that, but it comes at a lower cost, and for me, that is clearly progression, and it is great to see. I don't believe that there's a clear winner here or one camera is better than the other. The only thing I think that is pretty obvious is that if you need photography or photos in your life and workflow, then you should probably go for something like the Lumix. Let me know in the comments below which camera that you'd rather have and your thoughts from these tests. I would love to hear them all. And if you want more information about the Lumix S1RII Mark II, watch this video right here.